Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do here in the Valley?
Yeah, so I am a licensed professional counselor. I have been working in the field now for 20 years. I am the founder and executive clinical director and CEO of Thrive Therapy.
And this week, we're talking specifically about depression. And I think one of the first questions is wondering, how do I best even identify that might be something that I'm struggling with?
Yeah.
What are some of the signs that you could self-identify to go, I think I might be in a state of depression right now and struggling with that?
Yeah, so the basics are you want to look for changes in sleeping and eating habits. One of the telltale signs is losing interest in things that normally bring you a tremendous amount of joy. So for instance, if I really get energized by coming to church and all of a sudden I'm not coming to church, we might call that anhedonia, right, or the absence of joy with things that usually give us joy. People also suffer from a sense of lower self-esteem than they normally would suffer with. There's a belief that they're a burden to others, and that if others were honest with them, they would say things like, you're really more of a hassle than I want to have in my life right now. There's the issue of hopelessness. There are thoughts about self-harm of a non-suicidal nature, and then also self-harm that would be designed to commit suicide. And those are the core features. But that sense of hopelessness, right? Yeah. Also helplessness and worthlessness would be, I would call that the sort of the underground river of depression that haunt most people who really struggle with chronic depression.
And help unpack that a little bit between chronic depression and just maybe being in a funk. 'Cause sometimes it feels like I'm just having a bad day, a bad week, and maybe just eating a whole carton of ice cream is going to soothe everything, and then in a couple of weeks you're feeling better again. Yeah. What's the difference between that and being in a state of depression?
I think you're going to look at where the depression stems from to determine the difference between those two things. If it's a biological issue, right, which we know depression is very much about the neurotransmitter serotonin, you can expect that that's going to be a chronic sort of a thing. If our depression or hopelessness, helplessness comes more from a circumstantial thing or an external thing, then we could expect that it's going to be seasonal, provided that we address it appropriately. But what people struggle with, Christians, non-Christians alike, is the acceptance of the reality of these things in their lives. So in other words, they don't want to be depressed, so they pretend like they're not depressed, which actually makes the depression worse.
Okay, let's stop right there. So let's start with the external, maybe the short-term depression.
Yeah.
Something bad happened at work, something frustrating is going on with the kids, a medical diagnosis is given to yourself or a loved one. And sometimes as Christians, we just want to press on as opposed to what? Like, how should we best handle those emotions, to handle those moments so that it doesn't become chronic depression?
Well, I think that's just it in a sense, is recognizing that we're not called to be perfect vessels, right? That we do struggle. And there's a place where we might have a crisis of faith, right? Or our soul might feel downcast. And the idea is not to run from that, right? But actually to lean into it, because we don't get better from depression by going around it. We get better from depression by going through it.
Wow. That's big. You get better from depression by going through it.
Yeah.
So taking the time to grieve a loss or express your frustration at circumstances, to be able to process through those things as opposed to just pushing through. That's a key first step, it sounds like.
It's a massive step.
Okay.
Like the fact that you already hit on grief, which is something I wanted to make sure we brought up today anyway.
Yeah.
It gives me a chance to kind of like broaden the scope a little bit. So I see depression as either biochemical in nature, right, or circumstantial in nature. But there's also the grief process aspect of depression, and there's also the spiritual aspect of depression.
Right.
So you're talking about grieving. If you look at it from a traditional 5-step model, there's this relationship between anger and sadness before we get to a place of acceptance. And it's in that place, and this is my opinion based on 20 years of experience, is where we see people get stuck in depression as it's related to grieving because they don't know what to do with anger and they don't know what to do with sadness. So it's like this flip-flop back and forth, back and forth. And one of the really basic definition of depression is anger that is internalized. So there's a real relationship between carried depression and unresolved anger.
You've got the anger and you've got sadness. And sometimes as Christians, we feel this sense that, we just need to push through those, or people around us are just giving us a pat on the back. Hey, it's okay. Just get over it. It's going to be a better day tomorrow.
Yeah.
But to actually take the time to settle in those and fully experience those emotions so you can press through them, that's actually the way that we get healing. That's what you're saying. That's how we help move through depression.
100%.
Because that feels counterintuitive, right? Like, just turn on some happy music, do something positive, just kind of ignore the bad feelings, focus on the positive feelings. But that actually, you're saying, sets us up into this trap or this cycle that causes the depression to drive deeper into our heart.
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of that type of advice just results in avoidance. And because we take our brain with us wherever we go, we take our heart with us wherever we go, we can't avoid anger that's unresolved, or sadness that's unresolved, or depression that's unresolved. Eventually, we have to give it an audience, in a sense. And talking through it, right? That sense of putting words to our thoughts and feelings is the manner in which we navigate through them. Any avoidance-based strategy is good in the short run for like a crisis situation.
Right.
But ultimately, I have to be able to talk about my anger. And here's a really interesting sort of funny story. Going all the way back to my graduate school years, my professor was working with a Christian guy, successful businessman, and had a lot of anger towards God. And so my professor points out, hey, it seems like you might be angry with God. And this guy's like, you're darn right I'm angry with God. You know, he did this, 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 and this. And so my professor's like, well, maybe you should talk with him about that. Right? And the guy's like, oh, no, I would never tell God that I'm angry with him. Right? And so you get this sense of like, okay, bro, did he not understand that God already knew that he was angry with him? Right?
Right.
But I think a lot of people are hung up on this idea, like, how honest can I get with God about my feelings, especially if my feelings are in relationship to him?
Yeah, we put up this wall, this barrier that, we don't want God to really know what we're thinking, really know what we're experiencing, but he sees all. He knows all. He knows our innermost thoughts. He knows our words before we even speak them. So the ability to speak out loud your fears, your anger, your sadness, your frustration. I mean, I'm hearing from you that that's the key to unlocking a breakthrough.
Yeah.
So let's maybe flip the tables a little bit. How do I help a friend or a family member who's going through depression? Like, what should I be thinking through as opposed to giving the wrong advice or just that pat on the back to say, hey, don't worry, be happy, everything's going to be okay?
Okay, so the first thing you got to take a step back on that. In order to be able to do what you're talking about doing, which is imperative, you actually have to know your friend relatively well. And to be in relationship with him or her long enough to know when they are behaving differently that would suggest something has changed.
Right.
And so a lot of times, and unfortunately in our culture, even though you guys are doing something like this, which is phenomenal, right? Bringing mental health awareness into the church, there's still a stigma associated with, being mentally ill and being depressed and what that means about you, right? So reason I bring that up is because if I'm going to approach a friend, I want to know, first of all, how sensitive are they to concepts associated with mental health or mental well-being? Like, can I use the term depression, or is that automatically going to set up a wall for them? If so, I might start off way over here in left field of just saying, hey, how you doing?
Right.
Can we meet at the cafe and get a coffee? I may never mention the term depression at all. But I'm looking for things like anger, like sadness. Where are your levels of hope? Do you feel connected to other people? How do you feel about yourself these days? Is it, if your baseline self-esteem is generally here, but for some reason your self-esteem is down here, and I've noticed it, right? Because your eye contact's different, you have a tendency to walk forward now with your shoulders and sort of hide your body. But a lot of these things are really subtle, and the only ways you're going to pick up on them is to know each other.
Yeah. Can you unpack that a little bit more? You just gave a couple of body language things that are some signs that we could be looking for in the people that we're the closest to, that we know the most intimately. You mentioned the shoulders kind of leaning forward, not making eye contact. Are there any other signs that we could be looking for?
Well, actually, those are the strongest signs to me, but they have multiple meanings attached to them, right? So usually when you're receiving poor eye contact, to me, it has a tendency to suggest that a person's hiding something. that they don't want to talk about, right? Or there could be the presence of guilt or shame there that doesn't usually exist with them. The shoulder forward thing could result from a person who's trying to hide something about them physically, right? That they've become ashamed or embarrassed over, or to protect themselves in some way emotionally, right? So we're guarding our heart in a sense. And it also is indicative a lot of times of, I don't want you to see me. I don't want you to see my eyes, and I want you to see myself, so I'm hiding. Now, can we categorically say that that's the case all the time? No, absolutely not. But what we're looking for are differences. My friend generally operates like this. All of a sudden, they're behaving like this. That's where I'm going to start asking my questions.
How much should we just be listening, and how much should we be trying to give advice? Because I know, especially for guys, we want to fix it, right? So we hear that our buddy's going through something, and it's like, well, do this, this, this. But how much of the helping and the healing is just listening? What's the balance there?
90%, actually. So I tell people all the time, if you truly want to know someone, you have to listen with curiosity. This is sort of a buzzword that we have in the field, right? You're listening with curiosity, listening to understand. But I'm really going to listen 90% of the time. And when I actually say something, it's going to be a very quick, open-ended question or comment that either elicits more information or is validating of what the person just said. Okay. But the more, it's just a simple rule, right? The more I'm talking, the less you're talking. But I want to know you. Right, so I'm going to shut up and put on my therapist face. Right, that's how we would do that.
Yeah, just listen, and once again, allow them just to communicate, get those thoughts to flow. Because do you find, as a counselor, do people often solve their own problems once they start hearing them a little bit more? Is that part of it?
It is a part of it. It's not as much a part of it as I was taught in graduate school. Because there are different models that basically say, well, you've got all the wisdom inside of you already. You just need someone to help you kind of piece it together. And I just don't find that to be the case.
Necessarily.
But there are some folks who are really good at listening to themselves, provided they have an opportunity without someone telling them that they're immediately wrong. How could you possibly think that? That's ridiculous.
That shuts it down.
Immediately. We got nothing out of that,
What are some leading questions to help somebody continue to talk?
Here's one of my favorite therapist lines of all time. Tell me more about that.
Tell me more about that.
Bingo. Right? It's just an open invitation. It's totally safe. You haven't given any parameters on what the person is supposed to say or not supposed to say.
Yeah.
It's wide open, right? Or just little validating phrases like, oh, that seems like that might have been difficult for you. Or, wow, I'm not sure what I would have done in that situation. What did you do?
Yeah.
As opposed to the advice giving that you referenced at the beginning of this conversation. There are places and times for advice giving, but they're much fewer and farther between than we generally give them credit for.
Now, as we're working with a friend or a family member, how do we identify that what they need is beyond the help that we can provide? That they may actually be trending towards self-harm or suicidal thoughts, or the complexity of their situation is more than we can solve or encourage through a coffee and conversation. How do we identify some of those lines where they need a higher level of help?
So the first thing I'm going to look for in that situation is increased isolation on the part of that person. Right. So if I notice that person is not showing up to the social connection-based events that they're normally a part of, or the different ministries and that sort of thing, that's a telltale sign. And then within the home, if I also notice that person is now spending a lot of time in their room, a lot of time outside on their social media devices, maybe out in their car, again, doing these things that are out of the norm, that isolation is a really high predictor that behavior has escalated. Okay. You could also look at, specifically as it pertains to self-harming behavior, there's going to be a change in the way a person wears their clothing for the most part. Okay. The clothing is good. It might not be seasonally appropriate any longer, right? So in other words, it's 110, right? But now I have long sleeve shirts on.
Oh. Yeah.
Where did that happen? When did that start? And I don't want to get too much into the self-harm stuff because it can become almost teaching how to do it, right? And of course, I want to avoid that as much as possible. But if you do notice, the bottom line is if you do notice any sort of scarring or things of that nature, you don't want to take it lightly. So you could say, well, it just looked like a scratch, right? And we have animals and our cat scratches us all the time. If we have all these other aspects in play, then it's appropriate to think, well, maybe the person is actually scratching themselves. So even if they are just scratching themselves, self-harming behavior is an escalating behavior.
Yeah.
So we want to stop it at a scratch
before
it becomes a cut, And then as far as suicide is concerned, there'll be talk about death in a sense. Like, I wonder what it's like on the other side. Or I've been thinking about death and dying lately. I've been dreaming about death and dying lately. But the two things that stand out to me the most that are really telltale signs are giving away things that are extremely important and personal to someone. Like, let's say I have this bracelet, it means everything to me, right? Because my grandmother gave it to me. All of a sudden I come up to you and say, hey, I want you to have this. That makes no sense to me at all. You that's never left your wrist. Can you explain why you want me to have it right now? And then the other thing is excessive displays of emotion when the person has never really been openly affectionate. I'd be paying really close attention for those two things. And then another high risk factor is, do we have either a friend or a family member in our lives that has either attempted or committed suicide? That's what I'd be paying attention to there. And if we're dealing with self-harm, we're dealing with suicide, right off the bat, it's time for a higher level of care. So let me explain that real quick too, because higher level of care is a buzzword in therapy world. And there are multiple. So the lowest level of care would be like outpatient. That's when you're coming to therapy like once a week for an hour. Then you step it up to something called intensive outpatient therapy. It's about 9 hours to 12 hours a week. It's a combination of individual and group therapy, sometimes family therapy if it's needed. Next level is something called partial hospitalization or day treatment. So this is where a person may come anywhere from 8 hours to 14 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. And then we get up to residential or inpatient level of care where a person's going to go and stay, and they might stay for 30 days, 45 days, 60 days or more. And that's our job, right? That's why, you would refer someone to me and say, hey, Sam, can you help me figure out what is appropriate for this person?
It's certainly not something we should handle on our own as we start to identify those, to be able to escalate that and get the help that somebody needs. It's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't want to handle it on my own either. And I don't. I have consultation groups I'm a part of, even after 20 years in the field. Like, I'll consult with my mentors and people who have much more time than I do, because I don't want to miss something. And obviously, this is some of the most important, area we're going to walk as therapists or as people in ministry.
I want to go back a little bit to just as you're personally identifying, self-identifying, maybe a season of depression or slipping into that. We talked through being able to talk it out, embrace your emotions, understand your anger and your sadness, find somebody that you can talk to. Is there anything else that an individual can do to help them kind of work through and process through that season, whether that be physical or social, anything else that people should be thinking about?
Well, you just identify the top two, like the basic low-level interventions for depression. Increase physical activity, increase social activity.
Okay.
Right off the bat. Now, what that looks like depends on the person. Journaling helps. If we move more towards a therapeutic intervention side of things, journaling helps a lot of people.
Okay.
But for a handful of people, they don't connect with it. And then for another group of people, it actually make things worse because they end up seeing their thoughts and feelings on paper now. So here, it's just sort of ambiguous. In ink, it's concrete. It's become real, right? And so that can often become overwhelming for folks. Similar thing with art. A lot of people do a phenomenal job using art to various different creative modalities to externalize the feelings, but you run into the same risk sometimes. If I take my depression, what it feels like in here, and actually put a picture of it on this wall, that might be too much for me to handle. So you have to know your client, your patient, your friend well enough to determine, is that an appropriate intervention or not?
How have you seen COVID and just the experience of social isolation, how has that affected depression in general?
Oh, I think we've seen a significant skyrocket in the prevalence of depression, for sure. The specific numbers, I'm not really a numbers guy, so I don't really pay attention to that kind of stuff. I can tell you that the calls at my program have gone through the roof over the past 4 or 5 months, mostly depression and anxiety, right? So there's a sense of hopelessness and powerless about the future that's also coupled with uncertainty about the future, which is primarily where anxiety is going to come from. So the two of them are just, the prevalence is just notching up. The prevalence of telehealth therapy has made it a lot easier for folks who would never have thought about showing up at a therapist's office before to actually now engage in a therapeutic process. So what you're having is probably this idea that these folks would have been underreported or never reported as far as statistics of depression are concerned. But once we open the door to video-based therapies, again, that's another reason that the numbers increased the way they did.
And that's a relatively new service that people may not know about, but there's actual video-based telehealth counseling. Is that available? And does that seem to work? I mean, are people engaging in that?
Yes. Different types of people engage in a little bit more than others. It works better than I actually thought it was going to work, to be honest with you. And my preference is always going to be physically in the room with the person so I can feel that sense of emotion presence, right? It takes more effort on the part of the clinician to be able to do that through the video screen, right? So it's harder, but it's not like you can't do it. And I've been surprised actually at how powerful some of the sessions really become. So I don't expect that telehealth is going to go away at all. My expectation is it's going to become a bigger trend over time.
Sam, you have a real connection to the Lord, to the Word. What are some things that we can cling to from Scripture? Maybe it's somebody from Scripture, a story that we could read, or some verses that you find just vital for somebody who's going through a season of depression to recognize that they're not alone and that God's people have been struggling with this for a long, long time.
The folks that show up in my office are largely individuals who've been Christians for a really long period of time, who have suffered tremendous losses. And there is a sense of disillusionment, with where was God?
Yeah.
What I found is, and my degree, by the way, just so everybody knows, my counseling degree is just as much biblical as it is psychological, right? And I went to Regent University in Virginia Beach, which I'm very proud of.
Yeah.
Changed my life. But what I came to understand there is that, Christian counseling, in my humble opinion, is not the ability to attach a particular scripture to a situation, right? And just be like, okay, here you go. Read this in Jeremiah, read that in Acts, we're good. But I like what you said about, are there certain biblical personalities who've dealt with things. And I love the victory, and I want to say it's Elijah on Mount Carmel, correct? He has this tremendous victory over the prophets of Baal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fire from heaven, all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's powerful. But then he finds out that the queen has put a hit out on him. And within 24 hours, he's in a cave in the desert. And he's basically suicidal, depending upon how you interpret what he says in the cave.
Yeah.
But this sense of you've abandoned me, why did you set me up for this? Where are you? But, God's pretty slick, pretty wise. His response to Elijah is, why are you here? And I always get a kick out of that, right? Because obviously God's not asking a question because he doesn't know the answer. He's not looking for Elijah to depart some sort of wisdom that he doesn't have. The question is, it's introspective, right? It's Elijah, what are you doing here, bro? You were just literally on the top of a mountain. You saw what I was capable of doing, and now you're hiding, right? And there are so many different aspects of that, right? And this is where I stop with my armchair theologian and pastor kind of stuff. I'll leave that to you guys, right? But the thing that blows me away is the fact that God showed up in that space. That's what people need to know. Yeah. Is not so much the why I'm here, because we're never going to get a satisfying answer for that. Like I've got, just like most people, pain in my own life, I'm never going to get an answer to it, right? Like I got to come to terms with that. But I do need to know, and right? And do feel that in my lowest place, in my saddest place, in my most angry place, his presence is there with me, right? That is enough. And I think we struggle a lot of times as Christians when, we have certain expectations about how God should or should not act in our lives. And when he doesn't act in accordance with the way we think he should, we'll become resentful. There's a 12-step saying that says expectations are resentments waiting to happen.
Wow.
Right? So it's almost this situation, basically, that I'm trying to get to here is this idea, if I'm going to pull my way out of a depression that's of a spiritual nature, I'm going to have to remind myself that God's got it under control.
Yeah.
Even if the way it turned out is differently than the way that I wanted it to.
As you've worked with people who have gone through the valley of depression and then came out on the other side, and they started to experience victory and clarity again, what were some areas of growth that you see people grow and experience after they've gone through that valley? Like for those that are in it, is there something good on the other side? Is there a new perspective? Is there increased wisdom or understanding? What does the victory on the other side of the valley of depression look like?
It looks like humility. It looks like compassion. It looks like gratitude. And here's what I mean by that. There are certain things that can only be learned in places of pain and suffering.
Yeah.
Right? Like, in Jeremiah, where God says to Jeremiah, hey, go down to the potter's house because there's something there that we have to show you.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I love that idea because he's basically saying, if you stay here, I can't teach you what I can teach you over here. So you got to move, bro. And I think that so many times the moving that he's doing in our lives involves these valleys of depression. But when I understand my own pain, right, I have a tendency to become less judgmental. When I am less judgmental, I am more compassionate. When I drop my expectations about how God should be in my life, it allows me to take a position of humility in terms of how I understand my relationship with him.
Yeah.
And no longer am I telling him how I should be or what he should do. I'm allowing myself to feel his unforced rhythms of grace. Reference from the Passage Bible.
Yeah.
It's actually my favorite verse in the Passage Bible. The recognition of what we have, what he's already done. Not what he's supposed to do for me, but what he has literally actually already done for me. Depression will have a hard time being present when a person's in a place of humility, compassion, gratitude.
Wow.
No place for that, right? There's too much goodness here for depression to seep its way.
Say it one more time. Depression can't be present.
Yeah, it's not.
It won't stay long. It won't have a home.
No, when there's humility, compassion, and gratitude.
Humility, compassion, and gratitude. God doesn't waste our pain. When we experience pain, there's still amazing work that he does in our life so that as we go through that valley and come out on the other side, we become more like Jesus. We develop those attributes that really define us as children of God, made in his image.
Well, and if I could say one more thing, that my understanding of what compassion means is it's a form of love that's activated in the presence of severe pain, right? And my sense is, like doing really basic word studies of the Gospels, that's probably the baseline emotion that Jesus operates in, is compassion. And if it's good enough for him, I think it's probably good enough for us.
Wow. That's good.
Yeah.
Sam, let me ask you this question. This is a little more personal, but have you ever struggled with depression?
Oh, man, I explore my life a lot.
Yeah.
Right? And I think any good counselor or therapist should do that. If I go back to high school, I would say probably 10th and 11th grade, I was depressed. I didn't know it. Slept a lot. And keep in mind, I grew up in a minister's home. My dad was a pastor, so I was dealing with all that kind of stuff.
Sure,
right? Perfect
same.
elder kid.
I grew up in the same home. Yep.
Super loyal.
Yeah.
Like I was following the rules, man.
Yeah.
What was happening for me over time, though, is that that anger aspect of things was developing because I was growing up and making my faith my own and starting to see through some of the junk. And then unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, my parents' ministry was to the down and outers,
Mhm.
right? So there was not, this is hilarious. This was my life. And I think it's funny sometimes. It's not uncommon for like a person who just got out of a mental institution to be sitting in my living room, or a prostitute who just got off the streets. Like that's legit. Like that was the way I grew up. And so 2 things came of that. I saw a lot of hope, right? Because these people were getting healed, saved, and set free.
Yeah.
But I saw a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And that can catch up to you every once in a while.
Yeah.
So I would say I don't feel like I've been depressed since I was a teenager, but I do feel a tremendous sense of sadness on a regular basis. But the difference between the two is that my sadness doesn't come with hopelessness. My sadness comes with hope.
Yeah.
Whereas depression, you want to, in a real simple definition, is it's sadness with hopelessness.
Mhm.
Right. I actually think there's a place for our pain to be redeemed. Man, if I ever lose that, it's time for me to retire.
Because that pain, that compassion, that's what compels us to give people the hope that they have in Christ. I mean, I'm sure as wild and sad and broken the stories were of the people that were in your living room, you also got to see the change that happens when Jesus became a part of their life, when they got baptized and lives began to change.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would share some of that with you, but I wouldn't be able to get it through the tears.
Yeah.
It's too good.
Yeah.
You know, when I'm going to try to get it through the tears.
Yeah.
When the heroin addict, prostitute gets clean and becomes a mom to 4 kids.
Yeah.
A good mom.
That's
What
Jesus.
do you say to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's only one person making that happen, and it wasn't a counselor.
Yeah.
You know, it's amazing.
That's the hope that we have, right? I mean, that's why we're able to have this conversation. That's why we're able to tackle mental health issues head on, because we have a Savior that changes everything, that can bring hope to the hopeless, that can bring life to the lifeless, to those who just feel like what does tomorrow hold? Jesus knows what tomorrow holds, and he's got big plans for each and every one of us. And he's there to walk with us, by our side, giving us the grace that we don't deserve. And it's because of Jesus, it's because of his grace that we can face tomorrow. Sam, thank you so much for having this conversation with us to help us better understand depression and ultimately the work that God can do even in the midst of that.
My pleasure.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.